All right, good day, my friends. Happy December, and welcome back to a Dominion's Five Nation Guide. You've had a few quiet months from me, as the rush towards the end of the year has absolutely flogged me at work. However, I'm now on Christmas break. I have a clean run through to the holidays, and after a long year, there is nothing I want to do more, other than perhaps sleep a little, than recognise the patrons and supporters who've sort of stuck with me while the rate of videos has been lower. So what I'm going to try and do in the lead up to Christmas is try and do a video pretty much every 1 to 2 days, rather than the usual 2 to 3 at best a week, and occasionally just one a week. I'm going to try and really up the pace. I'm going to try and clear a backlog of Patreon requests in recognition of the guys and gals who have stuck with me over what has been, I imagine, for a lot of you, a bloody difficult year. And what better way to get back into it than to close off in this video and next the Jotun line of giant nations, some of my favorites in Dominions, with 2 back-to-back nation guides. And depending on the preferences of the person involved, maybe we'll look at Vedia too. But today we'll be looking at MA Jotunheim, the middle incarnation of the national line. We'll be following the same structure that you know and love. We'll be taking some knowledge around the unit types where there are repeats and summons. I'll take some knowledge as a given, but we'll go through the lore evolution. We'll have a look at the commanders and units, at least the new ones, and summarize the ones that we've seen before. Look a little bit at the new summons, and then we're going to get into strategy, because one of the great benefits, I think, of doing these nations in order or building them up one after the other is that as you look at the MA and LA incarnations, you can spend more time in discussion talking about strategy and ideas and execution, and less about just covering the basics of the nation. But cover the basics of the nation we must do. So let's have a look at Jotunheim's overview. And here's the basics. Jotunheim is the evolution of Niflheim, but by the time you get to the Middle Age, the Niefels are no longer common. Where they exist, they are no longer they're summons only, which represents the law of them being very, very few in number at this point. Instead, you have Jotun leaders ruling the nation, whereas once before they were just the humble lieutenants. And by their side, you still have the hags from before, and also more and more of the everyone's favorite little goblins of the Dominions universe, the Vettii. Now, the Vettii means that this is really now goes from being a size 6, size 4 nation to being a size 4, size 1, 2 nation, which is a great transformation for it. The Vettii do bring a lot to the table. So while the Middle Age turns down the sort of almost mythical power of the giants, because you have the Niefels disappear, you still have a powerful giant lineup supported by the Vettii. Now, the other thing to note in the lore sense is that Jotunheim continues not to be a particularly unified nation. It has survived the various wars that it's fought with the elves and whatnot. Like, the giants continue to exist, but it's still basically just a collection of jarldoms. There are individual jarls, there are chiefs that have their own forces and lands that very, very, very rarely join forces. And perhaps this explains, well, despite being really powerful creatures, that and the constant war with the elves, if not for any intervention by an Ascension War or a human player or a pretender god, the lands of Jotunheim don't really amount to much. They don't really achieve much going into the late age. They just continue this period of decline, wherein giants are steadily displaced, first augmented by the Vettii, and then displaced to begin living amongst humans going into the late age. And that greatly frustrates some of the Gigia and their super incarnation, the Jan Vidyas, who are like basically super Gigias. These are, which we'll talk about in a minute. That basically pisses them off and they bugger off. And you're left with a human cross giant nation by the late age. But in the Middle Age, you are still, as befits the age, in that transition point. This is still a giant nation. It's Jarls with the hags whispering in their ears, and the Vettii sort of live alongside them. Now, in terms of thinking about the structure here, you have Jotun Jarls ruling the main lands, the Gigya influence them, and then the Vettii serve the Gigya. So the Vettii are like a super rural forested population that serves the hags, and the hags have influence over the Jarls, but the Jotun troops and whatnot seem to answer to the Jarls themselves. So you've got an interesting sort of feudal tribal nation that lacks the cohesion, the industry, the organization that you see with the nations that really sort of go bonkers with expansion. That's the humans. That's, I guess, the law says Abyssia is very successful, and I guess Abyssia has numbers in industry as well. It's just an interesting comparison that basically the Jotuns hang around in the Dominions equivalent of Scandinavia, doing not very much, but everything is different in actual games of Dominions, where, well, let's just say Jotunheim tends to do a fair amount. Let's talk about this roster, this interesting hybrid roster you get. Some units that you have in the Middle Age will be familiar to you, and so I don't have to go over them again. The Jotun militia, so the Bondi, the Jotun Javelinist, who these guys haven't improved anything since the early age, but they were serviceable and they remain serviceable, particularly the Javelinist, because 23 piercing thrown damage doesn't go out of style. Neither does a length 4 spear with 24 damage and the ability to do a few repels. Hurlers haven't gone out of fashion either. Hurlers are still a hilarious way to kill things by throwing a 36 damage rock at their face. And it's still the case that Mega Blessed, Super Dodge, High Defense, Sacreds, whether they're White Centaurs, whether they're Ponyboy Elves, it doesn't matter. They still have, or tend to have, serious problems with having 36 blunt damage just piffed at them. So the Hurlers have not gone out of fashion either. The Huskarls, the Gudi Huskarls, the Hirdman, this Jotun lineup, there's been very little in the way of technical advancement, tactical advancement. The troop lineup is basically the same. What has changed instead is you now have a Vettii lineup, Vedia Archers, Vettii, Wolf Riders, and Moose Riders. And by the way, I'm not sure Vettii is the correct pronunciation. And I'm also really going to struggle when we get to that word there, which looks like goad to an English speaker, but I've heard good, I've heard goe, goa, both of which I think are heavily influenced by other languages. I think people are just very confused. And unfortunately, the one person in my family who speaks Danish, which is usually my best go-to for Nordic pronunciations, even though, yes, I know Danish is a long bloody way from Old Norse, I haven't been able to get in touch with them in time for this video. So I'm just going to embarrass myself with Gurde and see how that goes and get laughed at later by people from that part of the world. But hey, I'm Australian. Let me go with it. Anyway, Vettii on a moose. I guess you technically have moose as a species in your nation too. And then 2 versions of basically super Jotuns who take the role that used to be filled by the Niefels. Let's have a look at the Vettii first. The Vedia Archer is there are archetypes of units in Dominions, and lots of units compete to be what is the cheapest archery platform I can put together, because people tend to get excited when they have super cheap archery platforms. Slingers are an example, Makata archers are an example, and the Vettii is an example as well. The problem is the reason people talk about how good cheap archers can be, pygmy archers, is another example, is because Flaming Arrows works really, really, really well on cheap arrow platforms, and this is not a nation with Flaming Arrows ability. So, while you do have what here is, for its price, a quite effective, stealthy, short bow unit with a actually reasonable dagger attack at 11 attack, like this is not a bad unit for 6 gold size 1. It's even got 12 magic resistance. Shitty morale because it's a freaking goblin, but a good unit that is not as good as it could be because it has there's no flaming arrows capacity built into the nation. If it did have flaming arrows, the Vedia Archer would probably be significantly part of the meta. The Vettii himself, so the non-Vedia Archer form, what you gain here is you get a shield and a spear. The shield gets your defense skill up to 12 from 9. So, and at size 1 and 8 hit points, that might be enough. That might be enough to take maybe one hit. And if you have 6 in a square, it's not likely you're going to take more than one hit quickly. It's going to take a while. And you do 12 piercing damage, which is, it's human standard. That's what a human sort of militia light infantryman does. Only you do it for 7 gold in a size 1 package, which isn't bad. Plus you're stealthy and you resist cold. You are a little slow though. So Vettii of this size, and to an extent also the Wolf Riders, who we'll look at in a moment, are useful because they fill squares. You have size 4 giants, so size 1 troops can share squares with size 4 giants. What this means is that whereas normally your size 4 giant would take 100% of the incoming hits, like well, axe warriors don't exist in this era, but that high damage infantryman that's going to come up and like bonk your giant, let's just say you're fighting an Amorian lictor. You're fighting an Amorian lictor, and he runs up and he wants to put his 30 stupid damage mega bless axe right into your giant infantryman. If you are sharing or interleaving Vettii with your size 4 giants, then when that axe swings, it's got a chance instead to just hit a Vettii. And yet it'll completely annihilate the frickin' Vettii, but that 7 gold Vettii has just saved the life of, say, a 40 gold Gudi Huskal, who is actually capable of killing the lictor, and thus keeping that guy alive, while also adding a bunch of attacks, which, if nothing else, serve to harass down the defense of your opponent and mean that 29 damage axe is much more likely to hit its target. So the Vettii serve an important role of filtering through your line and reducing incoming attack density while increasing outgoing attack density, and also just tanking hits for your giants. So I like them. You also have Wolf Riders. Wolf Riders are a little expensive for what they are. So you've still only got 8 hit points, but you're paying twice the gold. You get an extra attack, and you get 2 extra defense points, but you're doubling the gold cost relative to the number of hit points you have, and you're going up to size 2. But you've got 18 map move, you're stealthy, you've got snow move, forest survival, you've got pillager, cold resistance. This can be a raiding unit. They're going to take attrition against anything but the lightest PD, but they can raid, they can pillage, they're mobile. The other thing that all of these units can be good for is patrolling. You can get a lot of Vettii if you need to patrol. If you're not going to use summon patrollers, you can build up Vettii and use them as patrollers. So that's an option as well. But just in general, having stealthy little size 1s, size 2s are handy. Also, these units are all recruitable in forests and require no special infrastructure. So at the start, this is particularly important at the start of the game, but it's important later as well. If your forts are busy, or before you have forts, if you have forests, you can pump out troops. You can convert gold into troops. And because the problem you have with non-fort recruit troops a lot of the time is if they require a lot of resources, well, without a fort, you're not going to get many anyway. Vettii cost like 4 resources and 9 recruitment points. So you can actually get decent numbers of them out of your forests. Wolf Riders, 18 recruitment points, 4 resources. And Vedia Archers, 3 resources, 8 recruitment points. It actually costs fewer recruitment points to get the archers. The Moose Rider is funny, I just don't like it. So the Moose Rider is Vettii trying to be a giant. It's also a hybrid unit, and as you know, hybrids in any situation don't tend to do everything well. They just tend to do everything in a mediocre sense. Unless you're the F-16, in which case... yeah, you're just a really good deal for everything, like fantastic multi-role aircraft. So Moose Riders, 25 gold, 38 hit points. So you got a lot of hit points, but you've only got 4 protection, 9 attack, 9 defense. But my question is, what is this unit trying to be? It's got 2 short bows, so it kind of wants to be an archer unit. But who wants to pay 25 gold for something that shoots what is basically 2 short bows. Like, no one wants that. And then you're like, okay, it's got a kick and antlers attacks, so it can go out and it can do some reasonable damage on the front line, maybe. But your giants do that, and your giants do that without having 4 protection and with better stats. They don't have 2 attacks, but they've got 1 much better attack, and they're much more survivable, and they're not much more expensive. So I give Moose Riders a pass. Like, yeah, cool. I think they're stealthy. I think they're funny. But I think that's a no from me. Then you have 2 sort of super Jotuns who are both capital only. One's non-sacred, one is sacred. Ulfheden, the Wolf Brothers. These are skin shifters. These are Jotun skin shifters that you all know and love. So these guys are kind of cool. They're a little psycho. They wear enchanted wolf skins, and when they would die, they're capable of shapeshifting into wolves. So what does this unit give you? 70 gold, 5 resources, 38 recruitment points, and not sacred. So instantly, you should be looking at this and thinking, aha, this is a unit I can recruit before I clear my cap circle, and thus have resources. And it doesn't require a bless. So Ulfhedens should just twig as something you can recruit early on if you go dormant or before you've cleared your cap circle and you can't recruit anything that's more resource intensive. They're a great gold sink. You get 40 hit points. They're a size 4 like all Jotuns. 12 protection is okay. They're going to take a lot of hits, but 12 protection is okay. Attack skill 12, skin skills 10. But they're fast. They have high magic resistance. They have fantastic morale, and they have the classic susceptible to shock but cold resistant, snow move forest survival, and regeneration 10 built in. Just built into the chassis, 10 regeneration. Which means if you are using these guys early, let's just say you've got a dormant regen bless, you've got something that can do the whole regen giant expansion early. The problem is they don't have quite enough protection to survive certain indie types, but against others, they'll shrug it all off. And then they come to the table with a 26 damage spear, length 4 spear. So they can do a little bit of repelling. And when they hit something, like they hit it, 26 pierce, that's 20% off the top of any of their protection. Then you put the 26 damage in. They're going to hurt. If they hit, they'll hurt. They're not berserkers, so they don't get like that sort of attack boost or protection boost, which is a little strange. But they are also more survivable than they seem, because when they turn into their werewolf form, they go over to being a 2 attack, still regenerating, and they've got their extra hit point pool to play with. So, Ulfheden, it's a case of knowing what they do and do not counter. And they're really suitable for deployment early on, or if you have little bless, or if you've got a dormant, or I don't know why, but if you have an imprisoned bless, if you have no resources, there's a lot of cases for the Ulfheden. I use them. One mode of expansion is to use them in the expansion phase. That's the one I favoured in this test game, which is the first time I picked up Jotunheim since I subbed into a game some time ago, which we'll talk about a little later because it plays into my experiences here. Hrimtursar. This is the new Niefel giant. It's not truly a Niefel giant. It's the case that these are basically, so if you remember Tiatse, or however you pronounce that guy's name, the abductor, the Niefel hero giant from the early age. Well, he's still around in the middle age. He's the last Niefel Jarl. He's still around. He's still a hero. You can still get him. And these guys, these guys basically, they bunk at his house. They live at his house, they've got his blessing, and they're basically paragons of all that Niefel virtue once was, and as a result, they're basically baby Niefel giants. They're only 100 gold, which makes them considerably cheaper than they once were. They've got 41 hit points, which is unfortunately weaker and smaller than they once were. At attack 12, defense 14, they're respectable. 43 resources is expensive, as is 40 rec points, but so is 100 gold. You get 20 protection, 13 magic resistance, 14 morale, and then you still get, not as much as the early age, but you still get chill aura, cold resistant, and ice protection 1. So in cold 3, this is 23 prot, which is very respectable, and a chill aura. It still puts people to sleep. It's not as strong as it used to be, but it's still there. It's respectable. Your attack skill on your sword is a 13 attack, 29 damage swing, which messes whatever it hits up. 29. I love giants in that sense. Like, you just casually throw out numbers like 29 damage. Why not? And of course, sacred. So you're paying half upkeep on them. So they have the same upkeep as 2 Moose Riders. What would you rather have? 1 Hrimsherding or 2 Moose Riders? That's a very simple question to answer. And they'll take your Bless. And the Bless that will allow you to solve this susceptible to shock issue and give them regen, and you're good to go. This is a much more I think this is a pretty usable sacred. For expansion and early warring. They'll beat up a lot of stuff. They're still vulnerable to specific giant counters. They have all the strengths and all the weaknesses of the Niefel giant are basically turned down a few notches in the Hrimsherding. Cool, let's talk about commanders. We still have a Jotun scout. He's still memey and stealthy, which makes him a bad scout in the sense that you can't spam him, but it's still funny because if you have a cool bless, you can still go and meme out on people with the scout. The chief is your stealthy raidie commander who can lead your wolf riders and your Vettii and all that. Very cheap, 40 leadership, spam them, recruit them in forest, don't have to wait cap turns. That's fort turns. It's cool. The Hurlers, the Good, and the Jarl, all as they once were, basically. The Good still gives you priest level 2, and more importantly, a low resource cost. So when you're trying to make every unit count in the early game, it can be a better deal than the Jarl. The Jarl is the better commander. Gigia, we recall from earlier age. Then we've got new stuff. Well, new and changed stuff. Let's go with the least changed first. We still have the Skrati, the Skratir. However, this is a bit of the Skratir has sort of gone down a few notches. The Skratir in the Middle Age is no longer sacred. So you don't have that half upkeep anymore. You can't take a bless anymore. So you can't build regen in. But they're not cap only and they're not sacred, which is both fine traits. And they're still water 2, blood 2 with a random, which is still a respectable set of paths. You can still get up to blood 3 here. So the Skratir are still here to do 2 essential jobs for you. They're still here to be some of the best turbo communion batteries in the game. They still are, because they still have inbuilt regen in their werewolf form. And they're still here to thug for you. They have more upkeep now, but you don't need a temple to recruit them, and they're cheaper, which partly compensates for both of the previous problems. So even though the Skratir have been downgraded from their earlier incarnation, they're still fully capable of doing their basic core jobs. Same with the Gigia. It's the same basic unit. It's still capable of doing the same basic tasks. Then we got some new mages. The Thrim's good. God, I must sound so weird trying to pull this stuff off. But hey, I'm doing my best here. Thrimsgård. Someone can judge that in the comment. Thrimsgårdar? Is that the plural? There we are. Slavic languages as a background are not good for understanding Nordic languages. Not really. This guy, I don't think he's great. What you're paying here is a cap-only, resource-intensive, 245 gold, priest 2, and he's a priest 2, so I don't like him. I don't like priest 2s. The system for automatically calculating costs, which the developers then use to calculate and then may adjust up and down for specific cases, it considers priest 2 really expensive, and I don't think anyone else considers priest 2 that good, so you end up with a unit that's more expensive than it should be. It's water 1, random, air, water, death. It's a shitty researcher for its price. It has ice protection, cold power 1. So what you've got here, and a 39 damage battle axe, by the way, what you've got here is something that can hypothetically be like a heavy sacred thug. It can try and do what the Skrati used to do. It can like quicken self, mist form, or whatever the case may be, depending on how you kit it out. It's got quite a few hit points. If it's sacred, if your bless includes regen, it can regen itself. It's got cold power, so it can run up to like attack skill 16, defense skill 14, which is not great, but it's something. And your ice protection can push you up to like Prot 19. Problem is there's no head protection, so you need to put a helmet on. Like, it's there. It's there. I just haven't seen them deployed in very great numbers because most of the people are too busy recruiting young Vidyas instead. Which leads us to the young Vidya and the Vettii Hag. Let's talk about the Vettii Hag first, because I think the Vettii Hag is awesome. It's awesome. This is a complete shitbox mage. And I love shitbox mages. It's a mage that is just the real basics. So what have you got here? For 40 gold, and you're basically buying no frills here. You pay 40 gold, you get 7 hit points, 7 attack skill, 6 defense skill. You're not paying for anything you don't need. 6 morale, which is trash, so you don't pay for anything more than you need. It's slow, it's old, it's shit, but it's cheap, and you can recruit it outside your forts, and it's not sacred, which means you don't need temples to recruit it, and even though it's only got 5 research ability, that means that you can recruit for 40 gold outside your forts in Magic 3. Not everyone does Magic 3, but I love doing Magic 3 as MA Jotun. You get 8 research points for 40 gold outside your forts. The funny thing is that also this slap attack, it's 1 armor negating magic damage that also shrinks the target when you slap it, which I think is hilarious. Like, that's just a funny attack. And then random path. So look at this for a moment and think about it. You have astral, death, nature, blood. So from right to left, right, congratulations, that's your blood economy. You have a quarter of these 40 gold mages that you'll be shitting out of every forest. That's your blood. They give them sanguine dowsing rods. They're blood 2s for 40 gold. Congratulations, you have a blood economy. I did sub into a game as Jotunheim once. It was one of the ones that Lucid was playing in. I only played a couple of turns because my schedule got in the way. But when it was in the very late middle or early late game. I think early late game is a failure description. And when I took over, Jotunheim had a blood economy that was doing like 60 blood slaves a turn, like nothing. It took me 5 turns to turn that into 400 slaves a turn by deploying lots and lots of Vettii that were just stacked up in labs, not deployed on blood hunting duty. Mass sanguine dowsing rods, deploy them, get the patrollers in place, like mass summon patrollers, get everything out, start burning the lands down, and we were Vampire Central 5 turns later. This is just a cheap way to get your blood economy going, and I love it. Nature 1, well, they're on research duty because if you do go magic, 40 gold for 8 research points is super functional. That's super fine, and they can hold a research booster as well as anybody else. So if you can get yourself a source of research boosters, which is hard as Jotun, it's one of the weaknesses of the nation, it's hard to get research boosters, they can hold them just as well as anyone, and you're going to cry less when the lightless land gets them eaten by horrors. So Nature 1, they're researching, or admittedly, they are stealthy, so you can literally go swarm raiding with these guys. They're stealthy, they can carry a gem, you can go swarm raiding with some 40 gold Vettii Hags. So that's perfectly fine. Death 1, no one should complain about Death 1 for 40 gold. At the start of the game, if you get a few of these in your capital, they're the ones who can run reanimation and get you some giant long dead and get you extra expansion parties and chaff early on. Later on, sure, they can research. They're in the research category. And then Astral 1, 40 gold for an Astral 1. For 40 gold to block mind hunts, 40 gold to go do magic jewels, like, you're going to run a heck of a... If someone rolls at you and they're an Astral Nation and you can throw 40 gold mind hunt magic jewelers at them, you're going to make people cry. You want to burn a communion? Like, yes, normally the Jotun build is the turbo communion, where you have the Skrati just suck up as many casts as you need. But if you want a communion where you just want like a 4 path boost, this is how you do it. Yes, you're going to blow the Vetti up, but like 40 gold. 40 gold. I like cheaper shit mages that are only trying to do one thing. And this mage, while it's trying to do lots of things, any given Vettii Hag is only trying to do one thing. And so you're not paying a premium for stats you don't need. Yes, in the late game, they get absolutely murdered by remote attacks and whatever, but they're stealthy. You can hide them. You can protect them. And they will research, and they will run your blood economy, and they will be there when you need them in combat, and you should have 1 million of them. You should have 1 million of them. They have basically no infrastructure setup cost. I love the Vedia Hag. It's a great addition to the nation. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there's the Vedia. The Vedia is a super Gigya. It's a Vedia that's trying to do even more. So what are you paying for here? Basically, when it comes down to it, what you're paying for, and yes, it's got Adept Crossbreeder and Death Curse and all this cool stuff, but if we're doing a national overview, what you're essentially paying for is the fact that you go from having 1/1/1 and then 1 random to 1/1/1 and then 4 rolls at the random, of which 3 are 100%. So you're basically rolling the die on getting higher paths. Hypothetically, it is possible to get a Death 5 Yigya, a Blood 5 Vedia. It's possible to get a Nature 5 Vedia or an Astral 4 Vedia. It's just incredibly unlikely. But rolling the dice on Vedia is one of the ways in which, if you don't have a given path on your pretender, or you can't get there using Skrati or whatever, you're going to get these higher paths. A lot of these combinations are useful to greater or lesser degrees. The question is the premium 350 and 2 cap turns as opposed to 165 gold and no cap turns worth the extra randoms, as opposed to just having something that is either an Astral and then Cross, or a Death 2, or a Blood 2, or an N2, all of which are useful? And the answer is not early on, but once you get past the early point, then probably, because you're going to want some stuff that goes up to those higher levels. You can get to Blood 3 fairly reliably using Skrati, but you can't get the Blood Death Cross on the Skrati. So if you want to roll some Blood 3, Death 2, or whatever, in order to start thinking maybe I'm going to play the vampire game or whatever, rolling a couple of Vedia is the way to go. So it adds to the nation by being there, but I'm not sure I'd spam them all the live long day at 350 gold non-sacred. That said, you can get away with a lot of indulgent spending when you're Jotunheim, because you've got this cheap as shit Vetti Hag to sort of hold things up for you. So, this is the troop lineup. It's similar to before, and the mage lineup is similar to before. It's still got a functional deployable thug. He's just been downgraded a little bit, but made cheaper as a result. But you've got some nice little utility picks to help augment your troops in exchange for losing a recruitable super combatant chassis. You no longer have a recruitable super combatant. In exchange, you've got little line fillers for your troops, and you've got the immense utility that comes from being able to spam 40 gold mages that can be blood hunters or undead summoners or swarm raiders or magic jewelers or all those sort of things from every forest with a lab. So there you are. We're going to do a quick pivot. We're going to have a look at the summons, which are mostly the same, but we'll look at what's different, and then we'll come back, we'll talk strategy. Okay, here we are with the 2 new national summons. Everything else here is as before. The Draga, the Rimvetti, the Dwarves of the Four Directions, the Garm, Ilwinter. They are all as they were, so I'll direct you to the Early Age Niflheim video for them. None of them are super relevant anyway, other than Ilwinter, and if you build for it, Dwarves of the Four Directions can be funny. You get Summon Glossos, and you get Winter's Call. Summon Glossos is a fairly early game summon. What you have is a Death 2 summon. So Death 2 is a Death random Gigya, which for 13 gems, so just over 1 per unit, 1 and a third-ish per unit, you get a Glosso. A Glosso is a size 3 sacred 8 protection boar with lots of attack but very little defense skill, good morale and magic resistance. It resists fire, it's dark vision, it's stealthy, it has a heat aura, and it's a sacred trampler. So, whenever you have a summonable sacred as a nation, you got to look pretty closely at it, because being able to summon sacreds is pretty cool. It's part of what makes Nazca so balked, is the fact that they can get Condors. Now, Condors are better and cheaper, however. So you've got to think about this. Now, this unit, depending on your bless, is probably going to be regenerating 3 hit points per turn, which might help it survive. I think it's niche, but I don't think you rule it out. If you're fighting in the dark, it's going to slaughter unprepared enemies that forget it exists, especially if they're human-sized. Because in a dark environment where it's much less likely to get hit, that regen will keep it alive even though it's only protection 8. Or if you can put some protection buffs on it. In the early game, you can't really. Stealthy means you're going to get it where you want it to be. The heat aura is an interesting one that people do not expect out of the Niefel line of nations. Like, heat aura? Really? You expect that? So the answer on is this worth it comes down to, what is your bless? The more hellish your bless, the better a summonable sacred is. You do have death income, so you're going to be able to summon it. And the second is, what are you fighting and in what terrain? If you're going to be fighting in caves, if you're going to be fighting in the dark, or if you want to troll some people by raiding with this thing, I guess you could. The problem is you're going to need... Oh, it doesn't say it's magic being. I would have sworn this thing was a magic being, and thus you could only lead it. I might summon some back in the game and check. If you can lead this without magic leadership, then I'd be like, sure, this will make mincemeat of PD. And is 13 death gems a lot of investment for something that kills PD? I don't think so. Like, not really. Considering people put brands and things on stuff all the time to thug them, maybe some Glosso like are okay for Conj 3. It's okay. Winter's Call, however, is better than okay. So you get it at Blood 6. Blood 6 notably is one level before the Blood 7 cutoff, where you start getting the things like Vampire Lords and things like that, which let you really play the Immortal game. It's Blood 3, Water 2, which means this is a Blood Skrati. Can cast it just straight out the box, so you're going to have access to this spell, because you're probably going to get to Blood 6, and you're definitely going to have enough Skrati that you get 1 with Blood 2, Water 1. And in exchange, for 86 Blood Sleeves, you get basically what is a cheap upkeep Niefel Jarl. Your good old friend, the super combatant from the EA. And this is why I'd say you haven't really lost the Niefel Jarl. You haven't really lost the recruitable super combatant. The difference is now you pay blood slaves for them, and thus they're not capital only and they're not limited. They're still the old fun guys that you know and love. They're still Water 3, Death 2, Holy 2. They got a random. They still got 75 hit points. They're still size 6. They've got that Ice Protection 3, which can make them really tough. They've got an incredibly strong Cold Aura. They've got Cold Power. They're still the devastating SCs you know and love, only now they cost 86 Blood Slaves. And that's cheap. For an SC, that's cheap. They're not immortal, unlike your Vampire Lords, which is what I started spamming as Jotun when I took over that game. Like, I think I put like a dozen Vampire Lords out in like 3 turns, I think, because I had to recruit 1 or 2, and then they created 2 or 3 more, and then those created 4 more or 5 more on the turn after that, or whatever. They were going nuclear over the course of those turns. But 86 Blood Slaves is a really cheap price. You need to remember Blood Slaves are not worth as much as gems. So if I reconstructed this question and instead said, hey, is a Niefel Jarl worth 20 gems? People would say, yes. So it's worth 86 Blood Slaves. You can have a blood income that lets you summon 3 of these a turn, 4 of these a turn. It's doable. once you get to a certain stage of the game. At the very least, you can recruit 1 or 2, and that's a lot of SCs to be putting out and augmenting your basic forces. So I think Winter's Call is a good spell. If you're fighting on everything I said about Niefel Jarls in the early age applies. The difference is you don't get them early on, you get them later on, but when you do get them later on, you can get them in very significant numbers because you're now paying blood slaves rather than gold. And you should have a lot of blood slaves. Give me a sec, we'll talk about heroes. Okay, heroes, and I don't have worthy heroes loaded, so this is the vanilla lineup first. We'll load vanilla worthy heroes in a moment. There are 2 returning heroes that are there through basically the whole line. The difference is in late age, Angerboda goes to Vediheim, whereas Tiatse stays with Utgard. So Tiatse and Angerboda are still around, and they're still their old badass selves. Tiatse is still like your best super combatant, hands down. He's also your air magic access because he comes with air 3. He can turn into a flying monster. He can still cloud trap. He has the air death and air water cross, ice protection 3, cold power, shape changer into the eagle, as you all know and love, which gets you up to air 4 if you need to be at air 4. He's fantastic, and all the analysis that I gave you early on, not early on, in the Niflheim video still applies here. He is everything. He is access. He is a super combatant. He is a haha surprise. He is a battle support mage to throw some serious air magic into your armies, your critical armies when you need to surprise people. And he's still a fantastic candidate for being twice born, so you don't lose him. And I think once you twice born him, once he's died the first time, you're a little more careful with him. But he's great, and he's one of the reasons that a lot of Jotunheim builds I see still luck 3. He's awesome. He can't arrive before turn 20, but he's badass. He's awesome. You can get a lot of use out of him. Angerboda is still your best astral access. She's still like turns up to summon vampire lords sometime after turn 20. She's still capable of doing battle stuff by teleporting and whatnot, but she still can't walk around the map for shit because she's old and crippled. Not crippled, but she's certainly very slow. But she's there for the death 3, blood 3. She'll get you into the serious immortal games. You're going to give her a stick. She's going to be death 4. She's going to get you all the way up death if you need. She's blood 3, which is like starting to get serious blood numbers. Very easy to boost up from there. And like I said, she's ultimately there to get you into the immortal game if you want to be there. So you can't complain about that. Angerboda is a fantastic magic access hero. Then you got some new ones. Sportsnyal is a wolf lord. He's not particularly special. He's a super Vettii wolf chief, basically. That's basically it. Like, cool story, bro. Turns up with 3 wolves. These 2 are heroes for the same nation, and it just shows you that like the definition of hero is pretty broad, right? Like, do you want to be like a wolf dude who comes with 3 free wolves, or do you want to be Tiatse the Abductor who destroys entire armies for breakfast? Like, okay, but hey, no turn arrival limit, so you might get him early. Gulveg the Undying. So Gulveg is a MA Jotun only. She's a Gigya of tremendous power. I mean, read the lore, and she's actually pretty interesting. In her youth, she visited Valhalla, where she was stabbed to death and burned 3 times. 3 times she was reborn. When the Vanadrots realized that they could not slay her, she was allowed to stay in the Blessed Halls for a lifetime and a half. She mastered the magic of the Vanir, returned to Jotunheim, where she became one of the most skilled sorceresses in the kingdom, skilled in Seath, as well as Galdra songs and illusions. So, basically, the elves, she turned up in the elvish halls. The elves tried to murder her, and I say tried. They tried really hard. They killed her 3 times. They burned her body. Like, they weren't messing around. So I want you to think about this for a moment. So, Giant turns up to the elven capital, they stab her to death and burn her because, they're elves and she's a giant and that's just what they do. And it doesn't work, so they try again, And eventually they figure out, they can't actually kill her. So they're like, oh, well, we can't murder you, so how about you sleep on our couch? We teach you everything we know about magic, and in, a couple 100 years, you leave. It's really bizarre. It's like a Soviet spy gets captured in the US during the Cold War. They try and hang him. It doesn't work. So they're like, well, the hanging didn't work. So here, let's teach you everything we know about building hydrogen bombs. And you can hang out in like CIA headquarters and hang around DARPA until you head back to Moscow. It's a bit of an odd story, but it's very Nordic. Anyway, in terms of actual practicalities, what does Gullveig give you? Well, Gullveig basically gives you a really cool, immortal, mobile, stealthy rainbow mage that is just great to have. She takes away some of the pressure on Tiatse to be on the battlefield to provide you air magic. She's there with nature, with death, with astral, but Gigias bring, a lot of those paths, but she brings air. And she does it in a chassis that can cloud trapeze, in a chassis that can go into communions, and so give you really big air boosts. And ultimately, she's immortal. So if you've got her bundled up with an army, she's very unlikely to be soul slain. She's natural magic res 18, drop anti-magic, that's magic resistance 22, drop an anti-magic amulet on her as well. She's going to be anti-magic magic res 26. She's not going to be preferentially targeted by any soul slay effects over all the other units in the army that are going to suck up those soul slays. So she's likely to be properly immortal, which is fantastic. So you can deploy her. You can use her to site search when you're not at war. That's a really good use of her when you're not at war, because she's searching 5 paths at the same time. And when you are at war, you can deploy her basically disposably. Now, if you're not deploying her with an army, she's also, very trollingly, an immortal Wind of Death caster. She's a Wailing Winds caster. She's a Wind of Death caster. She can do all sorts. She can do battlefield nuke shenanigans. She can do Wrathful Skies with proper gearing, although that's a little bit harder. But she's capable of doing wipes while also being immortal. And as most Dominions players have felt, at least at one point, immortal units that can do battlefield wipes or spikes are brutal, and everyone hates them, and that's fantastic. So let's now load Worthy Heroes. I have not, in fact, loaded MA Jotunheim with Worthy Heroes, so I actually don't know what we're going to get here. So we still have Gullveig and Sportsnial and Tiatse. So looks like they've done some fixes in inverted commas. Sportsnial now summons a Wolf Rider per month. I guess. Yeah, okay. All right. So they've given him just a little bit extra. He gets personal luck, which makes him harder to kill. He automatically summons a Wolf Rider every month. That makes him less completely shit. And you've got Skrati, who is... Okay, and they've added Scotty and Loki. Okay, so we've talked about this before. We've talked about these before. Loki with Helheim, and Scotty with Niflheim. So Scotty gives you just a cool, stealthy, sacred giant. Water 3, nature 2. Useful, interesting, not completely world-changing. Like, it's certainly no Angraboda or Tiatse or even Gullveig. But it's something. Loki gives you fire. Now, Loki increases unrest and his stealth and his sailing, so he's got a lot of utility, but at the end of the day, you're going to look at Loki, and unless you've gotten independent fire mages, you're going to see, oh, he's got fire. He's actually fire 3, air 3, blood 3, all of which are good paths. So yes, he's a spy, yes, he's glamoured, yes, you can send him into enemy capitals and get their grafts, but really, what you're going to use Loki to do is get yourself a couple of fire gems, and a fire income. You're going to summon yourself up some flame spirits, and those flame spirits are going to make you lightless lanterns. Or he's going to join an army and cast flaming arrows and surprise everybody. But really, he's there to break you in a fire. Nice little addition there. So, cool little additions from Worthy Heroes. They may sports now suck just a little bit less. Skadi and Loki are good encouragements. This is a good hero lineup. This is this is something that is worth going luck in your build, I think. So let's go back and talk about scales, tactics, etc. Okay, so what are your broad tactics as Jotunheim? And the good thing about having done Niflheim already is we can talk about where it's similar and where it's a little bit different. The early plays, the basic army plays of Jotunheim are a little bit different from Niflheim, and you've got a couple more options available to you. You still have the option of going ordinary Jotun troops, and if you do, mixing them in with Vettii, who you're going to be recruiting from your forests in order to solve that attack density issue, is a good idea. If you're going to be deploying Ulfheden as your expanders, then pairing Ulfheden up with Vettii and then getting good at timing them so they arrive facing the enemy at the same time. The Vettii have to be positioned ahead. So this is an area where you got to get practice your scripting a little bit, but if you can get them to merge in the right way, you can get some really good expansion parties. Against a lot of things, Ulfheden can actually expand without support and rely on their shape changing and their regen and their BHP pools, and to a limited extent repel. But to improve their survivability, you can mix them in with Vettii. If you have an awake regen bless, regen and shock resistance is probably the minimum I would go, but there's a bunch of blesses available to you. But I've seen regen shock res used in 2 games now, and it's worked reasonably well both times. If it's dormant, you can time it so you've got Hrimtursar out when you're ready to go, or if it's awake, you can open with them as soon as you've taken your cap circle, because they're too resource intensive to spam a lot of them early. Hrimtursar can basically do 0 attrition expansion with regeneration against most things. They've got very high protection, decent HP pools. You add regen over the top, they're not going to die to most things. They're vulnerable to things like barbarians, like giants tend to be, but against just about anything else, 21, 22 prot and 4 regen a turn is going to take them through. And if you need to fight things like barbarians with them desperately, again, just layering up Vettii and Hrimtursar is the way to go. So you've got options to expand. You're not going to be doing like thug expansion or super combatant expansion or anything like that. You're going to be using ordinary Jotun troops mixed in with Vettii, or you're going to be using specifically Ulfheden, because these are the most gold efficient way to get really heavy combat power early on without spending resources. This is particularly important if you go like slot 1, as I think you are capable of doing as this nation. Really, the only units that desperately need lots of production that you want lots of are, in fact, your capital-only sacreds, and going prod just to get capital-only sacreds. That's very expensive when you think about it. So Ulfhednar early, Hrimtursar after. Cool. That's your early game. Then you're going to transition into your middle game. And your middle game looks an awful lot like Niflheim's middle game in a sense. You're still going to move into, at the same time, one more thing in the early game. When you're doing recruitment, when you're pumping out as many Ulfhednar as possible, you're going to be able to fit a couple of Vedia Hags into the recruitment cycle. And this tip comes courtesy of Hurlers, so I've seen do this. If you roll a death random on your Vedia Hags early, they can be the ones who start popping really mage turn efficient reanimations to get you more giant undead early on, which might give you an extra 1, maybe even 2 expansion parties in the early game, depending on your death gem income, which can speed up your expansion somewhat. I think in my test, we've got what, like a 26, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 26 province expand with a dormant bless. So it was Ulfhednar opening into Hrimtursar. So simple enough early play. Moving into the middle game. So the middle game looks similar to Niefels in a sense. You're still going to go like Blood 1, Thou 1, Ench 2, Alt 2, Ench 5. So you're still going into a middle game where you intermix the army, and it is more of an army. It's not so much the giant phalanx, although Rimtursar can sort of do that sort of job. Instead of the giant phalanx, it's more of a conventional army mixed in with some sacreds, but the core sort of destructive ball of your force is still going to be the Skelly Spam Communion with Skrati Turbo Communion. So that's going to still be your death ball. It's going to be Jotun Hurlers to knock down the walls. It's going to be some Gigias and some Skratir, and they, between themselves, are going to summon infinite skeletons at people and kill them. You can, of course, mix in all the other cool spells, the nature, so you can do things like Howl and whatnot. Mix that in. All the good things that you can do with nature, death, astral in a communion, led by awesome Jotun batteries who will have personal regen on them and be in their werewolf form and thus have 20% regen. If you want to get particularly fancy, there might be some paths you can roll with some young Vedias if you want to get some high magic early, but realistically, it's still your basic Skelly Spam, Howl sort of Jotun package of battle magic. It's still augmented by Skrati going out and thugging, still being mobile, dangerous, and efficient as they are in their werewolf form with their sort of basic allotment of gear. You might intermix some stealthy raiding from troops, maybe some Glosso, and whatnot. That middle game still looks roughly the same. What's changing a little bit is you're putting much more emphasis on getting like labs up in your forest provinces, maybe forting your forest provinces, but certainly getting at least labs up because they won't be burnt down, unlike temples. And you're going to start putting out a lot of Vettii Hags. Yes, you're spending heavily getting like Ulfhednar, Ulfhedens and troops, and the Gigias and the Skrati coming out of your forts are expensive, but you can save money by getting a whole bunch of these little 40 gold Vetti Hags out. And that's going to start your research economy. Well, it's going to augment your research economy because you're not a good research nation otherwise. You still have expensive mages. The Gigia is a fast researcher, but certainly an expensive one. Magic 3, you're going to get 165 gold for 16. That and non-sacred. So that's relatively expensive if fast research. It's going to be augmented by these 40 gold 8 research coming out of your forests. And this is going to let you boot into a blood economy in a bigger way probably than Niflheim. There are more huntable provinces. There are fewer gems on the map. So the relative ease and power of blood hunting has increased relative to the early age. So you're going to get blood hunting up and going. You're going to do that using summonable. You've got all sorts of summonable patrollers, and you've got Vettii available from forests, like just hanging around, who are cheap and effective patrollers as well. So you've got the tools in place to get a reasonable blood economy going, and that's going to be your pathway into the late game. You can still unlock the traditional Niefel late game of deploying a whole bunch of super combatant Jarls. You can still do it. You just have to get to Blood 6 and start summoning them. If you've dropped Angerboda, or if you happen to have the paths on something else, or if you got very lucky with some Jan Vidias, then going Blood 7 and playing the Immortal game, or going up Death and playing the Death Immortal game. So you can get big into the Immortal game, you can get big into the Vampire Lord game, you can start shitting out Niefel Jarls, get Construction 4, Construction 6, gear them up. If you spawn some of your heroes, you start having magic diversity, so you can break into more of that. And your army is kind of suited to the late game battlefield. They survive wipes pretty well just because they're big chunky units with decent HP pools. So they survive the high level remote attack spells pretty well. Your commanders also survive the remote assassinations and whatnot spells pretty well. So you've got some survivability as you move into the late game. So the differences are that you need to practice intermixing Vettii with giants in order to get the best out of both troops. That you need to adjust to not having Niefel Jarls to beat people around with, or Niefel Giants to beat people around with in the early game. Respect that Rimtursar are less powerful, but they're cheaper. There's a little bit of finesse in the deployment of Rufhednar, because they have minimal protection and they can get killed by specific targets. So where you position them and deploy them is significant. And of course, you're going to be fighting a whole bunch of specific threats in the Middle Age. You have to be ready for Ermor, you have to be ready for Celeria, you have to be ready for Nazca, you have to be ready for Pangea. Like, there's a lot of dangerous shit out there. But you've got specific counters to a lot of them. People really respect Niflheim. Like, really respect it. Like, people fear Niflheim. I don't see a reason not to thus fear Jotunheim. When reading about it, people are like, "Oh, Jotunheim is average." The only way I would argue Jotunheim is average is if we're saying, well, we're assessing it against the Middle Age, and there's just a lot of really powerful nations rocking around the Middle Age, and that's a reasonable argument. This is the age. Ashdod's out there, Ermor's out there, Celeria's out there, Nazca's out there, Middle Age Relay is out there. They're dangerous as heck. There's a lot of dangerous nations out there in the Middle Age, but there's also a lot of nations that are weaker than this too. Jotunheim can run a really good blood economy. They've got some really good mid-game tricks. They've got enough early game spine that they're not going to be just run over. They're a little bit vulnerable to Mega Bless Sacreds coming to mess with them early on, because their troops aren't that great and the Thrimsherding isn't going to stand up to them. But they've got tools. A lot of those super sacreds can be countered if Jotunheim can get to enchantment 5 and just throw so many skeletons at them that they get drowned. Like, White Centaurs can't deal with infinite skeletons. They can deal with a lot of skeletons, but they can't deal with infinite skeletons. Super tough sacreds don't do particularly well against Ulfhedens stabbing them with like nearly 30 pierce. No, super dodgy sacreds don't deal particularly well with 34 damage rock to face, 36 damage rock to face. Like, these are not great counters, but they're counters to just about everything. And the natural nature of the Jotun nations means that you are stronger on the defense than attack because you benefit from cold. You benefit, your Thrimsherdings are just better in the cold environment than they are when you go over to the offense. But that relationship is less obvious and less intense than it was for early age Niflheim, because you're no longer dependent on things that have like Ice Prot 3 and thus have no protection in the warm and are invulnerable in the cold. You have more freedom of operation. So all in all, I respect this nation as actually being a little bit, I think it's stronger than average. I think it's a good nation. Like I said, when I subbed in, it did not take very long to turn Jotunheim around into a real monster. Blood economies are dangerous. And Jotunheim has the ability to both run a blood economy cheaply and efficiently, and without distracting it from doing everything else. And still has enough national ability to turn it into really valuable stuff. You can get Niefel Jarls early, you can go Immortals, and that's enough. That's enough to have a really good late game. If you have big death, you have big blood, you're in the game. So that's your sort of progression as a nation. If you're lacking something, it's that you're lacking research booster access. Without air on a cheap recruitable mage and without fire on a cheap recruitable mage, you don't have early reasonable access to research boosters. You are reliant on things like trade, you are reliant on randoms and independence, or you're reliant on heroes. Okay, so let's talk paths. Paths and bless. Well, this nation would benefit from a lot of things, and it doesn't need a lot of things. Because the Thrimsherding because the Thrimsgård is less impressive than the Niefel Jarl, because the Skrati is no longer sacred, and because you don't need the Thrimsherding, the bless is less vital. But if you're going to take it, then they're giants. So regen and shock resistance, or at least some form of shock resistance, is still the way to go. You can get this relatively cheaply. Isle of Beasts is an option if you just want to go major shock, minor shock, regen is an option that gives you lots of points. There are expander options if you really want and you just want regen, but that leaves you vulnerable to shock in the late game. I would tend towards thinking that things like regen are still valuable because eventually you're probably going to summon up Niefel Jarls, so they're still going to benefit, but it's much less of an obvious choice than it was with EA Niefel, which unlocks a couple of choices available to you. You don't need lots of production, you don't need lots of order. What I think you do need is you get 1 free point for dropping to cold 3. Let's go to the God design screen to close this out. Let's have a look. Jotunheim, done. Okay, so let's start with let's look at the Idol of Beasts, right? So if you need it for expansion, if you do that, this is a Hurlers special. I promised I'd feature it in time. So there you are. That's awake. You get 1 free point for dropping to cold 3. Your nation is better at cold 3 than it is cold 2, so that's basically free points. Growth 3, because if you don't know what to do with yourself, then growth 3 is great. You can probably afford to go sloth 1. You end up something like here, and if you want to, you can do like weird things there. Like if you really value luck, but you don't want to like destroy your scales, you can do something like that, I guess, or something like that. You get a lot of freedom if you think you can expand without the regen bless. And I'm convinced that with a little bit of practice, if you're going to a competitive game, you can probably expand without your regen being online. And you can avoid a decisive battle in your first war until turn 11 or 12. I think you can do that. That gets you 150 extra points. Loses you the research from having the thing awake, but you can live with that. And all of a sudden, what that lets you do is take yourself up to Magic 3 and reduce this right down. You might even be tempted to do something like that. The reason this means you suddenly get great research value out of your Vettii Hags as opposed to not very good research value. Staying high luck is good, but this is also a nation that would benefit from order because it's a blood hunt nation, and order helps you reduce unrest and reduce the casualties of blood hunting. But I still think overall the luck is going to be a better scale. So this just makes your Herdings capable of... It removes their major weakness, and it means that they can win a lot of early fights against... If there are any independents left, you'll roll through them. But there's also a lot of early wars where having regenerating 100 gold, 22 protection, giant sacreds that do 30 damage is going to be enough to give people pause. And you can build the Herdings up before the Bless comes online. You can start recruiting them, and you can use them in low or zero attrition expansion early, and then bring the Bless online. So that's one way of doing it. There are lots and lots and lots of alternatives with his nations. Most don't revolve around Hell Blessing. They revolve around getting you access. So you could try and rainbow up, for example. I'm not recommending this, but I'm just saying. Yeah, sure. Let's go major fire resistance. Let's go defense skill. Man, we could probably go reinvigorate, strength of the earth, reinvigoration, probably reinvigoration. Might even take that up to 4. And go reinvigoration. And then, sort of build stuff like this. And the reason here is now you're thinking in terms of diversity. You're thinking, well, I want a little bit of fire magic without being reliant on my heroes, especially if you don't have worthy heroes, because if you don't have worthy heroes, there is no fire hero. And building an entire build to rely on a hero is kind of like a bit of a, that's a bit uncomfortable. So you can go rainbow, give yourself some access, kill some of these paths, and go 4s instead to save yourself some points. Start playing over here in the Blood Death access area or get yourself high astral. There's a lot you can do because I tend to focus more on the God build for nations that desperately need something. In the Nazca guide, for example, I focus a lot on the God build because really for Nazca it all comes down to that bless. For Jotunheim, look, regen and shock res is good, but there's a lot this nation can benefit from. It's got good heroes, so it likes luck scales. It's a blood hunting nation, so order would be kind of cool. It has a really cheap, low yield researcher, so Magic 3 is going to almost double the output from those guys. Like, it benefits from an awful lot of stuff, and it can put up with you making a lot of choices. Ulfheden don't care what your bless is. Vampire Lords don't care what your bless is. So you've got choices and you've got options, so you'll forgive me if I don't belabor the point of God design all the way. You've got the full selection of the Norse options. The one thing I'll say is I don't think, as much as I used to be completely anti-Titan, like I was so anti-Titan, and having seen people use them, I now understand, look, they're really, really dear, but they matter because good players can use them to turn an early war from a loss to a win in a very competitive game, and thus they're worth the very intensive point investment for some games and people. So I've softened a little bit on Titan chassis over time, but I don't think Jotun is the one to take one. The giant nations have recruitable, tough units. Niefel definitely didn't need one because they had Niefel Jarls. Eventually, Jotun is going to be able to summon them. They've got size 4s that are really tough. They probably don't need a super combatant Titan with that really heavy investment involved. They'd like a rock to mono drop people. Idol of Beast is basically a different form of rock with less protection, unfortunately, because it's made of wood. Sad for it, but hey, where is it? Idol of Beasts? Yeah, there it is. So, like, there's different ways you can go. You can't pick Omniscient Monolith, unfortunately. I don't think they need an expander to help them out. They've got a cheap regenerable expander in the form of the Son of Fenrir, if you want him. This is just a recipe to just go like that. But then you have to really trim some scales in order to make that affordable. So there's a lot you can do here, but you've got some freedom of operation in how you do it. I think the core of the nation sort of operates perfectly fine without. So that's Jotun. It's a nation which trades off early access to recruitable super combatants and extremely expensive juggernaut sacreds for pretty tough sacreds, some goblins that are capable of filling the line and adding a little bit of stealth to the nation, the Vettii Hag, and the ability to summon its super combatants instead in the late game. I think it's a perfectly fine trade-off. If you had a choice of which of these two nations to take into the early age, I would probably take Jotun. I would take Jotun up against Niflheim, and I'd be reasonably confident, I think, actually, in a large game in particular, because I think it's just better at running its economy, for example. The Middle Age is a tough space, but I still think Jotun has what it needs in order to take the fight to people, endure, and then boom in the middle and late game. It may not be Celeria in terms of late game boom potential, but it's still significantly capable. So it's a nation I would recommend. Thank you to my patrons again for sponsoring this video and the others like it. Expect more of these in the near future over the Christmas break. I hope the holiday season is treating you all very well, and I'll talk to you again soon.